watch it will fall over. Hold on a second. Go down a little bit. That's a bit better. The clip I usually use up there is that the glue came off it, so I'm using a selfie stick standing upright. It's more comfortable sitting in this than the other seat anyway. It reclines back further. So I hope you're all keeping well. It is quite remarkable the times that we're living in, and ultimately, for the first time in my life, and I don't say it gloatingly, or I don't say it like in that kind of way, for the first time in my life, the United States of America is not the most powerful nation on earth. And I'll explain to you why. And the collapse of the United States of America, or the loss of its status as the most powerful nation on earth, is also a domino effect which will have repercussions particularly on countries such as Canada, the European Union, and especially China. Now, this will be a long video. It'll be a bit of a... some of you might find it a bit of a boring pain in the arse, but I'm a keen student of history, and as they always say, those who don't learn from the past will always repeat it. Before I get to why the United States is not the most powerful nation in the world anymore, I would like to tell you how it became the most powerful nation in the world. It became the most powerful nation in the world because of the operating software of the nation, and its culture was so incredibly written and put into practice by the founding fathers of the nation at a point when, say, the European powers, particularly the French and the British, but particularly the French, were struggling to implement a similar idea as were the Prussians. But the United States had the advantage in that it didn't have all this historical baggage to fall back on. That was a major part of it. Another major part of it was that the United States was probably the first Western nation to understand the value of educating its peasants rather than keeping them impoverished and keeping them as peasants. Now, this is why you had literacy rates in the United States that were off the scale compared to like Europe at the time. You would have had to be a peasant in Europe to be able to read and write in the late 1700s, early 1800s was still relatively rare. You would depend on someone to read letters for you and this kind of thing. In the United States at the same time, you had farm boys, farm laborers behind a plow reading Voltaire and Rousseau and Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and then in the evenings discussing this with their friends and family. This created a sense of security and self-worth in Americans that was unique for any other culture in the world at the time. It wasn't based on snobbery. It wasn't based on a nationalistic, ethnic belief that they were better. It was based on the belief that it was self-improvement was the way to ultimately be a free person, which is true. And, you know, it's beautifully shown as things like Henry James Thoreau's Walden And even the other essays that man wrote, and he talks about the immigrants who would come and arrive in places like Boston and Manchester, New Hampshire, and Plymouth, and all those various places up in New England. And he said the majority would go into the sort of like the slum life, the impoverished life of the urban dweller. But he noticed that a certain percentage would say, I can get a piece of land in Maine, or a piece of land in New Hampshire, or a piece of land in western Massachusetts for nothing, or even for free in some cases, and I'll have an independent life where I could have a few cows, a few pigs, some chickens, and some arable land, and make a life, and I could have I can hunt, to supplement that and things like that. And he goes, and they were the ones who built America, the ones that had that little bit of extra moxie. If they're peasants from Europe, but they were getting in America what they would have got in Europe, except for Europeans were living with the legacy of kings and the feudal systems going right back to the Romans. Or America, it was a clean slate. And yet, even though there was exploitations and stuff like that, particularly like around the time of the Civil War and the treatment of Catholics, and both Irish and German Catholics, but particularly Irish ones got it worse. But Germans were pretty bad too. These were just glitches that worked themselves out. And ironically, these problems actually made America better, as did the treatment of African Americans. Now, America was on an upward trajectory for all of its history and achieved incredible things. It didn't win World War II. Russia won World War II, but its role in, well, it won the Pacific War. There's no doubt about that, against the Japanese, which was a tremendous achievement in itself, because it was just as brutal in its own way as what the Russians were facing in the East, in a different way. So that's how America became the greatest country the world ever known. It empowered its average citizen to reach levels of exceptionalism that European countries, with their class system and aristocracies, denied for the most part. And even when, in the post-World War II era, when they implemented things, social programs such as the NHS in England and all these other kinds of social welfare states that have popped up all over Europe, they didn't really do the same thing, because they made the European dependent upon the state, unfortunately. Now, having said that, there was lots of Europeans who rose from nothing as well and did well, and it's happened in Ireland, it's happened in the UK, it's happened everywhere. Now, in Europe. But it was easier in America because it was a given that was America. So you have a situation where this is going along and along and along, and I'm going to tell you how it stopped being the greatest nation on earth. And it happened firstly with the Watergate thing. Now, although Nixon was probably no more or no less corrupt than any other US president, it did damage the office of the presidency to an extreme degree, to the point where the concept of this father figure of the state was very badly violated in the public eye. This is also happening at the time of the Vietnam War, and then, even though the US lost the Vietnam War, it wasn't a catastrophic social disaster. Lots of major powers, the Romans and everyone, have lost wars to small nations over their history. That was not the main thing. It was a combination of that, the Arab oil crisis, and a few other things. It changed the American value system, and it became a little darker. And even with Reagan and everything, there was a sense of, there wasn't the same, the patriotism seemed forced, as opposed to, like, Americans didn't go around going, yeah, USA, USA, prior to, say, Reagan, because it was a given. It was, you didn't have to. Well, it's like saying, I'm number one. That's really kind of an insecurity, isn't it? So when that all began, born in the USA, the most misunderstood lyrics in history, I was in America in those years, and the jingoism was very apparent. But it was also kind of charming in its own kind of funny way too. It's hard to explain, but it was, I could tell it was rooted in a kind of insecurity, and that insecurity. Once that sets in, it's easy for it's easy to be exploited by the wrong kinds of people. And enter the Clintons, and this was the beginning of the end. The Clintons were basically a royal family that operated on the illusion of Bill Clinton as president when it was really Hillary Clinton was running it. And these were Southern, basically criminals, with a very bad history behind them in Arkansas, and two completely detestable people that were very good at hiding it in the same way Jim and Tammy Baker hid their shit with inside religion. It's that Southern superficiality. Not putting down the South now. I love the South of the U.S. and there's some wonderful people living there. But you know what I'm talking about? Those like 700 Club, squeaky clean on the outside. Now the Clintons weren't a moralistic squeaky clean thing. They were a sort of like were a business political squeaky clean on the outside, but dirty as fuck on the inside. And they brought in this thing called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which then made it possible. They claimed it was based on the European Union, and would be designed to strengthen Canada, America, and Mexico into a trading partner bloc. In reality, it was the signal and the financing for American corporations to start leaving the US and going overseas, because NAFTA eventually became a Pacific trade thing. And that's how they all got to China. So that was the first thing. NAFTA led to the situation where American industry ended up predominantly in China and a lot of it in Mexico. It also had implications to things like migrant workers and the treatment of Mexicans. And also, a lot of industry went from places in what they call the Rust Belt in America, Ohio, Michigan, and so on, and over the border into Canada. So it was because there was all kind of grants offered by Canadian provinces. So instead of them say if a factory was, say it was a heavy machinery plant in Cleveland, Ohio, well, they had to invest in a new plant. Well, the Ontario government over to the side of Lake Erie would just say, well, we'll supply you with the new infrastructure if you move your factory over here. So that was that was the beginning of that, and eventually we ended up in the interior of China. It's quite remarkable if you look at something like a Radio Shack or a Sears catalog from the late 1980s. Everything says made in the USA. All the electronics, everything. Now it's all made in China. There was imports, of course, from places like Japan, but they were Japanese companies supplying stuff to the US, just like the Germans could send them cars and heavy machinery. It was normal trade, but it was very different. NAFTA paved the way for American companies to transfer overseas to predominantly to China, with also places like Malaysia and Macau and this kind of thing as well, India and Ireland. Most of your pharmaceutical operations are in this country. Uh, we United States owns Ireland owns your ass when it comes to your pharmaceutical industry and your biotech industry. We own you, and Trump even said that, and he was right. And that's what happened. Clinton's second thing was after the Clintons, the neocons. The neocons staged a coup following 9/11 where they robbed the US of blind through all kinds of shell companies like Halliburton and so on. These people were out and out criminals. These people were these people staged a coup and they stole the United States. They robbed the country blind and they seriously damaged the finances. And how they did it was through war profiteering by owning the companies or having their friends or their connections owning the companies that would make the money from the wars in the Middle East that became as a result of 9/11. And they used it all to bleed the country dry financially. And that was the second one, the neocons. The neocons were also fascists in that they implemented things such as homeland security and the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act was another sort of like, it was like Watergate. It was like a damage to the American psyche. They'd say, wow, they've really, they've messed with the Bill of Rights in many ways and the freedoms of the Constitution with this Patriot Act. But I guess we kind of have to have it because we're under attack by Saddam Hussein, which they weren't. And then the media this is when the media and the politics came like that. But that was happening all over. And the final thing that stopped America from being the greatest power in the world was woke. And woke began with Obama. Now, Obama was ushered in as some kind of savior for the sins of America's past. The sins of America's past had already been addressed in terms of African Americans in particular. It was started to be addressed in the years following the murder of Martin Luther King, and particularly the Kennedys, who actually, Bobby Kennedy in particular, they implemented the beginnings of things such as affirmative action and other measures to demolish horrible things like the Jim Crow laws and to address the long-lasting legacies of African slavery, which were very real, very damaging, and you did have terrible things in the South that existed, such as the Jim Crow laws, and there was all kinds of gerrymandering when it came to elections and everything like that. And so that had already been in process. The fact that Obama was president had showed that had been corrected. There was nothing that needed to be corrected. African Americans had already proven themselves as worthy Americans long before that. But it was brought in as some kind of consolidation of everything. And the globalists basically threw all their power behind Obama because they saw him as the kind of globalist daddy, the globalist father, patriarch for the globalist world. Now, while that was going on with him, it was setting it up for a cascade of what we call woke. The United States was basically part of this globalist empire, along with the EU and all the others, and the Russians were to come in and join the party at some point. The Chinese were already in the door. Trump got in for a while and completely rattled the shit out of the globalist agenda, which America was hung on. They then rigged the 2020 election and put Joe Biden in, and that's when it went to hell. Because Joe Biden's administration felt subconsciously and consciously, that Trump's time in the White House had pushed back America 50 years. So they decided to speed up all the wokeisms in order to what they believe to address what they felt had happened under Trump. This is why you have a situation now where the Supreme Court of the USA can't define what a woman is. This is where we are. All the while this was happening, the wounded empire of the Soviet Union had collapsed into Russia, and we were told that Russia was a fallen superpower. It was a basket case. It was a mess. But it was coming around. It will join the global empire, the globalist agenda. It will come around. Now, any of you who play chess will always know that when you put the king into check, a chess master won't actively hunt the king to put them into chess. He will sit back and allow the king to destroy himself. And what are the Russians good at? Chess. Putin sat there watching the United States and the West demolish itself from within by not believing there were such things as genders anymore, by not believing, not knowing what a woman was, by having drag queen story time in schools, by putting incompetent people in top governmental positions, both in bureaucracy, in the legislature, and in particularly in economic positions, based purely on the fact of what race they were or what gender they were, and not if they were the right person for the job. And that was the West and the United States putting themselves into check. And they were checked by the Russian bishop, representing traditional Western values. On the cusp of the Ukraine conflict, they taunted and teased Putin, saying that he was about to launch a massive invasion of the country for no reason other than to rebuild the old imperialist Russian Empire. Well, if that's true, why hasn't he done it in the southern states? Why hasn't he invaded Kazakhstan? Why hasn't he invaded Turkmenistan? Why hasn't he invaded all those countries, Georgia, the lot? They were all part of the old Russian Empire. He called their bluff by actually doing it. They did not expect it and got the fright of their lives. And then the West fell. Not on the battlefield in Ukraine, but with some ridiculous sanctions against that, literally biting off the hand that literally fed them gasoline and food and fertilizer, particularly. So, overnight, Vladimir Putin, by playing a strategic chess move, and even Trump knew it before it happened, even though Trump has quite rightly pointed out that there's been civilian targets and stuff like that that were horribly hit in the war. Trump's called Putin a genius, because he's a genius. And he also said that he doesn't seem to be any particularly fond of Zelensky either. So all the cards were in the right place for Russia to take over as the greatest power on earth. The stupid lockdowns of the so-called pandemic, implemented by politicians working hand in hand with the CEOs of big pharma corporations. the ridiculous sanctions against the countries that's actually feeding you your oil, wheat, and fertilizer, and everything else. And then the woke thing, where instead of having an internal sufficient, self-sufficient economy, you're much more concerned with drag. Your president and the entire body politic of the United States is much more concerned with. Now, I'm not saying all politicians, but of who's in charge. Drag queen story time. And Putin just brought his army into the eastern part of Ukraine with no intention of going any further. He didn't have to. They played into his hands. Now, people have often wondered why there was no direct engagement between the Western powers and the Russian armed forces. It's quite simple. The Russians are actually advanced of anybody. They've discovered it's come out now that they have hypersonic drones that can fly at incredible speeds and strike just about anywhere in the world in very short time. American warship in the Black Sea, in a blink of an eye, found itself swarmed by hundreds of drones that were flying over the deck, alongside, looking inside the bridge house, and then bang, vanished out. It flew off at incredible speeds, synchronized. They have tremendous technological ability. We were told that the Russians are years behind, they don't have anything. So, while the Western governments were saying they couldn't define, were trying to figure out what the difference between a man and a woman was, the Russians were developing hypersonic drones. And I'm now starting to believe that those UFOs that were filmed by the US Navy a few years ago, that they're probably Russian weapons. They're probably Russian weapons. Just those UFOs that were filmed on those cameras turning at incredible speed and stuff like that. The Russians went off. They didn't put all their technical know-how into developing IT or Twitter. While a purple-haired Cenobite was on Twitter being triggered by somebody wearing a MAGA hat and banning their account, of the Russians, the equivalent in Russia, was developing new propulsion systems for flying aircraft. And that's what they've discovered. So, yes, 2 days ago in St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin gave the victory speech, essentially, of having taken over the world. He said that the United States is obsessed with playing God, and what he meant by that was trying to interfere into the natural order of things. The trying to be against natural law by not knowing by telling children, and he gave the speech before the Ukraine war as well on this subject, that the West was a sick, disturbed place, which it is, and it's obsessed with sexualizing children and stuff like that, which it is, telling children there's no such thing as mothers and fathers. He called it out perfectly. He also said that Russia has hypersonic missiles. He said that the sanctions were completely ridiculous and stupid. They only damaged the West. Russia is a self-sufficient country. Russian car companies didn't export to China. Russian electronics companies didn't move down to India. Russian mobile phone makers didn't move to Malaysia. Russian biotech companies didn't move to Ireland. Russian companies stayed in Russia, keeping Russians employed, using Russian suppliers and Russian raw materials. And so when the shit hit the fan, guess what? They weren't worried about sanctions because Russia was what the United States used to be until, what did I say, the number one destruction? NAFTA, a self-sufficient country. There's no reason why the United States shouldn't be, with all its land, its resources, and its population, its highly educated population. But it's not, because its industry is in China now. So in one fell swoop, he's damaged everybody. The Chinese are all. A few years ago, we were all worried about the Chinese being the new superpower and their troops would arrive and all their big military. But the Chinese power is a falsehood. It's based entirely on the prosperity of the West. The West ain't rich anymore. So the most powerful nation in the world at this moment is Russia. The United States has fallen behind. China has collapsed for the same reason. It's dependent on number two. It was on the previous number one, the USA. Europe is a basket case. Europe is actually the worst of all of them, and it's totally the fault of the European Union. To see Macron, hugging Zelensky, their toy boy, and telling him that, we're going to bring you into the EU. What will that achieve? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The damage is done. The damage is done. Now let's see how remarkable this is. You've heard me speak of this before, and I can't stop talking about it, and I can't stop thinking about it, because it's absolutely feckin' incredible. Putin has been our liberator. He liberated us. I know that I'm not saying this, I think he's a wonderful man, or he's my hero, or we should be all grateful. Nothing of that. His gamesmanship in playing chess with the West has done more for average people in the West who could see through the unfolding horrors of things such as the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and the Agenda 2050 and all those other things, Build Back Betters and all this. He liberated us from that. He liberated us from it. I will never forget, as long as I live, in the bleakest part of the lockdown, coming up to Christmas 2020, when you had Irish politicians absolutely in love with having enslaved their population and made them prisoners, going on TV and saying things like, well, it's too early to decide yet if we'll let you have a Christmas. Let that sink in. It's too early yet for us to decide if we will let you have a Christmas. You had Leo Varadkar saying, well, we won't be able to go on holiday for a long time. Then the smirk, probably never again. Literally telling us that we will be never ever to leave Ireland ever again, with a smirk on his face. You had Varadkar putting on a white coat, pretending he was a doctor, fighting the coronavirus. And it says, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar tonight has stepped down temporarily from his position as running the country in order to go help Irish hospitals deal with the coronavirus pandemic. And all these and that's just literally a picture of him putting on a white coat. Pure playing for the hicks, playing for the rubes, as they say in America. And here you read on Twitter fellas going, we're so lucky to have a gigantic leader like Leo Varadkar run this country. Look at how he reacts compared to Trump saying you have to drink bleach to fight the virus and this kind of thing. And they led us into hell. They declared war. All the Western governments declared war on their population in April 2020, and it was to be permanent and it was to be forever. It was to be what the globalists behind the unelected spooks, the secret unknowns, and the rest of them behind the scenes were to be the beginning of their implementation of their most appalling technocratic hellscape on earth, which would include legalized pedophilia, which is why they're obsessed with children and gender things and all this stuff, calling their kids non-binary and having drag queen story hour. At the bleakest point before Christmas 2020, when I was making the Rona Chronicles and doing my best to keep the tribe going, and it was difficult, it was as painful and sad and worrying for me as it was for you, but it's just because I felt like I was the one in the lifeboat saying, you know, a rescue ship is coming, a rescue ship is coming. And I did feel that way truly, but you know, when you see politicians saying things like, when you hear Irish people saying, we're probably not going to have they're not going to let us have Christmas this year. What? They're not going to let, and then you hear stories of families not having their children or their friends who are not, you know. I spoke to this one man at an event recently, and he told me a story, and you could see the frustration, but also the hurt in this man's voice and he's obviously an educated, highly intelligent gentleman, and he said to me that for his Christmas dinner, to see people he knows that he's known all his life and related to, who are highly educated people, show up at the front door, not shake hands or have to bump, wearing a mask, all in taking off their coats, all social distance in the living room, wearing their mask before dinner begins. Then dinner begins, they take off the mask, they have it, they're sitting next to each other at the table, they're taking selfies of each other by the table. Then the dinner's over, they go back into the living room and put on the mask and social distance. And he was just saying, I I wanted to scream. Can you not see the madness of what you're doing? The madness of this, how contradictory it is. I felt like that constantly back then, as did many of you. So in that bleakest, darkest period, John Waters goes on to Dave Cullen's Computing Forever show for an interview. And at the end of the show, Dave says to John, well, as Christmas approaches, how do we get through it? What do we do? And John Waters said, and after I shudder, I shudder now in a good way, in a way, but it still leaves me awestruck. John said, look to the Russians. Now, by that he meant go into the work of like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Solzhenitsyn to see how the Russians got through that in their own world, in their own time, in their own circumstances. But when he used that phrase, look to the Russians, it stuck with me. It was pure, and it turned out to be pure prophecy, because the Russians freed us from the horrors of what we were going through the lockdowns and the whole scandemic fascism that was visited upon us. And I said to John to his face, you know, that was an act of prophecy. And he's like, you know, whatever. He's been a Christian. He's a very humble, modest man. But it was, take it from me, that was prophecy. That was a higher force speaking through him to heal the nation with the words of what was to come. He can call it his God, I'll call it my gods. It was the daemon, the genius, whatever. The subconscious, the muse, the guardian angel, the Holy Spirit. You call it what you want. But that phrase, look to the Russians, was prophecy. It was divine intervention. Because it was the invasion of Ukraine that freed us from all the lockdowns. because that showed us also that they didn't take their own. They didn't believe in any of their things to do with the scandemic or anything like that. They believed none of it. They believed none of it because if it was that serious, they would have kept the stuff going. What happened was, imagine you have you ever worked for a boss, right? And your boss, you may be dependent on the job, and the boss does things like, well, you've only got, you can leave anytime you want, but it's rough out there. And say, can I have a raise? Oh, there's no money coming in. But if you want to leave, there's no jobs, but you can go leave. And that kind of a thug boss. And that's how he treats you. And then something happens outside of the company you work for, and suddenly he needs you. And he stops treating you like that. Well, that was like what happened with them. They were meddling away, destroying us with the lockdowns and destroying us with all that, all restrictions and everything else, and the colossal psychological terrorism of the mass media, particularly in here in Ireland, RTE, BBC in England, in UK, the all the stations, but there was colossal psychological terrorism put upon the population regarding what even Bill Gates now admits was a cold that killed most of the old people in their 80s. And only 84 people or so died in Ireland from the coronavirus. 84. That's from the Central Statistics Office. And when he invaded Ukraine, it freed us. It freed us. Because they had to suddenly go into damage control because their whole Great Reset, Build Back Better, had the arse torn out of it. They all thought that eventually Putin would come around and join them and become one of them. But he didn't. That speech he made before the invasion, where he said about how sick and depraved the West was the moment when he said, you could shove your World Economic Forums, your Great Resets, and all that other woke shit up your arse. You can shove it up your arse. And it sent them into panic mode and into a death spiral. Look towards the Russians. All they had to do then was for the king to put himself into check through sanctions that were self-damaging and all the other things that has wrecked the United States' position as the most powerful country in the world and has destroyed the West. We are in a completely different world right now than we were even 6 months ago. Do you realize that? You realize now the world that you're living in is completely different than it was 6 months ago. And remember, these vax passports were to be forever. Remember that? Forever. All this stuff we were to never travel again. They're making it hassle and stuff like that because of the airport chaos, but you can still doing it. So many things we were denied. Now, and who's gained from us? Us, people like us in the tribe. People like us in the tribe have gained from it. All we wanted was our freedom, and we got the greatest education ever. But we're also ready for what comes next, because I can tell you, we're not stepping into some kind of utopian paradise because the World Economic Forum has lost its power, and Klaus Schwab is just like a crazy old aristocrat again. It's none of that. It's not going to happen like that. There will be economic issues. There's not going to be. You get these doom pimps on YouTube talk about like it's the end of the world with famine and everything coming. There won't be famines in Europe or America. There might be food shortages, but that's not the same thing as famine. There will be unemployment problems, but that won't matter. There's no jobs anyway. We have entered a period of correction. The average normie will be completely rattled by what's going on. They have been bewildered and confused and they will be discarded because no one they never they're not like that. For all their servitude to their king, they're just horrible disposable pawns, like they always are. You're going to see some country somewhere next is going, and probably somewhere in Eastern Europe like Hungary, next is going to say, you know, how countries were before globalization, where they all had their own factories and their own everything and internal economies, and they only imported what they couldn't produce at home. Is Russia has shown that's still the best way to run a country. And that's what Putin said, that the future belongs to sovereign independent states. What he did then was put the tombstone on top of the New World Order and said globalization is dead. And you're going to see lots of countries looking at Russia saying, that's the way to do it. Look after yourself as best you can. Build, it won't happen in Ireland because we're slaves to the EU, but it could be you might be surprised it could happen to the England, and not about UK, wouldn't maybe not Scotland, but definitely you could see the England if with the right people in charge of a country like England, they say now that we're out of Brexit we can start building up British industry again like we had it before the 1980s. Don't be surprised if you start seeing coal mines opening in England again. Don't with the right government now. Someone like Nigel Farage, the UKIP Independent Party, but even like a sane left-wing Labour Party and not this new Labour crap. You don't be surprised if those coal mines that were closed in the 80s open again. Don't be surprised if car manufacturing starts taking off in England again. Don't be surprised if the French start saying, we should really make more things here. Don't be surprised if Canada ends up as 2 or 3 countries. Don't be surprised if the United States ends up as 2 or 3 countries. Because there will be states in the US who will not want woke. Now, woke is dead. It's gone. It's over. But that because the psychiatric element behind that and the political leadership signed up for it will have to be they will take down their states and their nations first. But those of us in the tribes, regardless of where we live, like I'm pretty sure the Irish establishment will destroy this country, on purpose too, just so they can bring it down. Because they wanted, they had all their chickens in the globalist basket, which is now dead. Putin said it, the future belongs to nation states, and he also said he didn't expect the sanctions to last much longer. Now, what does that tell you? He knows he has them all by the balls. Because as soon as Americans and Europeans don't have enough food, fertilizer, and fuel, the sanctions will end. He's holding all the cards. He's a chess master. It's amazing what's happening. And us in the tribe and people like us who understand these things, the greatest education in the world is only getting greater. Love yous all. Bye.